Yeah,
I prefer
Prime Minister.
yours. Yeah, I prefer yours from closing opposition after the 5th minute by chat. Starting in 3, 2, 1. SEA Games is a competition that's organized once every 2 years for the countries within ASEAN region. The primary purpose of SEA Games is to assist in identification of youth talents. That is why certain sports have age limit as to people must be below the age of 23 for athletics and whatnot. Secondly, oftentimes SEA Games is used as a platform for individuals to prepare for bigger major competitions, i.e. the Asian Games, the Olympics, or World Championship for those individual sports. All these things eventually shows that Asian continent is a volatile, up and coming, growing region in terms of sports, which SEA Games plays a pivotal role in assistance of the growth. What does status quo look like in terms of discretion rights for the host countries? Status quo allows host countries to exclusively decide the minimum 22 sports they want to host and other additional sports that they can decide based on their preferences. How do these host countries usually decide what sports do they want to do on a discretion basis? First, they oftentimes prioritize sports that can maximize their chances to win the gold medal. For example, in Thailand, sepak takraw is their biggest controlling a dominant sport. So they always want to table that sport. Even if Singapore is not being able to participate equitably, even if other states are not being able to participate or compete at an equal level. Number two, probably they don't have enough ground development for those kind of sports, which means they can't really ensure people participate from their own country within the first place. All these things means these countries that host oftentimes prioritize their own success within these sports, therefore neglecting other countries' needs, other countries' talents. That is to suggest, even if 10 other countries can play karate, 10 other countries have wushu teams, but if Thailand decides they don't want to have that sport, they can unilaterally say, we don't want to have that. What does counterfactual coming from opening government look like? Three things. The first, deciding right will be given to the SEA Games Council, where they have the capacity to establish a standing committee to discuss, reach a consensus decision, allowing countries to vote and reach the majority of what sports they want to participate. Second thing is oftentimes to be representative through reflections of data statistics that takes into account regional participation, precedents from previous sporting events as to how countries performs, the number of teams that they send, and whether it's equitable enough for all of them to participate. Thirdly, I also want to posit, probably opposition's biggest claim is, but they're taking a big hit hosting this thing financially and whatnot. Notice two things on how host countries are making immense amount of money. The first, oftentimes all countries that are members of SEA Council have to pay a yearly membership fee in order to facilitate the existence of SEA Games as well. Because they're getting benefit from the council. In order to be a member of the council, you need to pay yearly fees, which could cost up to billions. But secondly, in terms of hosting this, they accrue a huge amount of money through broadcasting rights, sponsorship that they get from dealerships in terms of brands that want to capitalize the visibility that they get through this event of 11 other countries within the ASEAN region. This could look like sporting brands, this could look like car brands, or any other brands that this wishes to capitalize. All this thing means the host country is making huge amount of influx money that gives them the capacity to develop and establish or organize even the best amount of sport. The problem here then becomes when host countries are given the exclusive right to veto against certain sports, not to host it against their own interests. Three pieces of problem. Why is it problematic? The first thing, oftentimes this does not take into account international sporting standard that is oftentimes views or values the principle of participation, access, equality, and also standards that are agreed upon internationally. What does it look like? For example, when Tokyo hosted the Olympics back in the 90s, judo was not really a famous sport, but judo was forced to be taken down because majority of the countries thought that it wouldn't be fair for them to participate in whatnot, despite Tokyo being a good leading character within the industry itself. This means oftentimes, since there is no clear metric to break the deadlock as to what we should prioritize, utilitarian metrics serves the best purpose in terms of fulfilling the needs because they're able to accommodate most number of athletes according to international standards, data and statistics rather than host countries' discretion. The second thing, oftentimes it's not representative of the number of people who want to participate. And according to my earlier framing itself, most of the athletes that come here are pioneers for every country. And they need platforms like this in order to fulfill the gap that exists between you being a national athlete and you being able to win medals in Olympics, World Championship, and whatnot. All these things means SEA Games becomes a unique platform for you to attain good judges, good opponents, which raises your skill barrier into becoming a more excellent athlete to reduce the margin between you and international standards. At a point which these countries who have discretion veto against these kind of vulnerable new and upcoming sports, which majority of the countries can facilitate and can attend, it inhibits the athletes' capacity to participate, which goes against international principle of equality. The second thing, it does not take into account unique nuances for each sport. Because notice, each sport oftentimes is being tied towards every country's cultural values. What do they primarily grow on upon? All these things means, given the fact that different countries oftentimes have different cultural priorities that they tie towards their sports, the best way to decide which sport should be hosted has to be done on a unanimous way in order to ensure most number of people are able to participate and capitalize upon the sport. Before I move on to the third problem, any prayer from closing?
Opening as a B1.
What's the delta in your debate? Because like it is unclear what the council will choose as well as what the countries will choose.
Oh, it's very simple. If majority of the countries feel that karate should be tabled and there's a majority decision consensus can be reached, those sport will be tabled. What sport is being vetoed or let down upon depends on the least number of voting, whether there has to be more data needed, more regional participants to be increased in order to fit the metrics to be hosted in the next spot. Third problematic then, oftentimes these countries also have the capacity to develop this vulnerable sport within their own country. For example, probably Thailand is not willing to engage in things like hosting karate and wushu, but because of the influx of the money, because of the necessity to develop facilities, you are also able to pioneer the growth of new and upcoming athletes within your region into those industries. Because facilities that are created, judges that are hired or trained locally in order to facilitate the competition means it could still be capitalized by these hosting countries in order to develop their own. All these things that in the end, what this does is, one, you allow access for bigger other countries to participate equitably. But number two, you also allow this host country to develop their most vulnerable sports, which previously they probably wouldn't have access. Three key pieces of weighing on why discretion should be removed. Number one, the scale of impact that we're able to attain in terms of participation and access means more number of athletes can be equitably participate and enroll. But number two, notice the nuance of assisting vulnerable athletes filling in the gap between world championships and other major tournaments can be uniquely fulfilled by SEA Games. Because absence of this, they don't really have any other big preparation tournament before they can establish it to higher seats. Third and finally then, the access, the weighing on terms of access and participation significantly is greater than cultural decision, which is limited towards very small actors.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister, for your fine speech. Elo.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes to both.
Okay. Yours verbally, please. The moment you give people who are passionate about sports, who are fueled by an essence of nationalism, democracy, that is when everything will try and be fought for, and that is when you get an inefficient sporting event. Few things I'm going to be doing in my speech. Firstly, to the top of my speech, two responses onto two arguments. Number one, what is the comparative? If it is the democratic process that OG claims it to be, number one, it's not that democratic to begin with because it's literally the council deciding, which means if some people have more power within this council or is like of a higher charter status or something like that within the council, they probably have more ability to like position or like table certain spots. But secondly, even if you want to argue that democracy is unique, it's not, because that's why there's an appeal process in our side, because we take into account the ability of countries to like make appeals on the basis of certain sports to be included. But secondly, the ideal situation that OG is fighting for is that everyone wants every single sport and we get to pass all these things unanimously and we get all sports included. I'll tell you why exactly this is a bad thing and it leads to inefficient process, because there isn't a description or illustration of a specific world that OG wants to particularly live in. They just said this will lead to good outcomes. We are unclear about what these good outcomes are. But secondly, onto the claim that country only includes sports that they're only good at. Number one, it is bogus to assume that countries will do this, because this will literally bring things like bad press and bad media, especially at a particularly important time where you would hope to benefit from tourism and hope to gain the favor of your Southeast Asian neighbors as a result of like hosting this particular event, if you are doing this to the point of like severe unfairness, I would argue that the scrutiny would be too much for you as a developing country to insulate yourselves from. But secondly, even if countries do this, at least different countries have more incentive to bid to host these sporting events in the first place, so that they can include the sports that they are good at. And this allows not just for a more diversity in terms of hosting, but also diversity in terms of winners. If it's a fixed list of sports every tournament, which is what's going to happen in your world, because all these countries want all the sports that they're good at to be included in this list, this leads to the event where a country like Singapore maybe, or a richer country within the region, dominating things like the medal count, because they get to dominate in all these different sports because the ability and funding to do so, versus in our world where this list probably changes all the time. This leads to a diversity of winners that can be visible to like the global sporting world or whatever, to show like different countries have the capacity to be good at different sports, versus the overshadowing that happens in the world of opening government. On to my first argument, and I'll also weigh out a lot of the claims that Rashwin talks about in his speech. How does this result in better planning and managing of the games? When we allow the country to decide, it means they have a better ability to evaluate their capacity. Number one, in terms of planning. What are the considerations before that of a country when deciding the schedule? It looks like things like logistics, facilities in terms of whether we have enough venues, whether we have enough stadiums. Are the stadiums of enough capacity to house all the people that are going to be watching? But secondly, also in terms of referees, it's not just whether we have enough referees, it's whether we have qualified referees for the sport, and are we able to pay them based on like the bid amount, or are we going to cut costs and hire like unqualified referees? These are all the considerations that you force them to take in the world of opening government just by analyzing it independently. Let's move it and break it down. Number one, in terms of planning. And this is when we talk about in terms of building new venues. I think I just have to give you one case study, and that is the Qatar World Cup. The reason why there were so many humanitarian abuses and like exploitation of workers is because there was a lot of media and public scrutiny that followed the news of them hosting the World Cup in the first place. Things like Qatar doesn't have a football identity, which means they don't have good enough stadiums. Qatar is too hot and players will not be able to play well. And this is why Qatar decided to build like large stadiums, all decked out with things like air conditioning and like to overwork workers as well. But how will it then manifest here? In a democratic process, because everyone will fight for some sports to be included, because everyone is good at something, right? Like some countries will dominate in terms of the world or regional championships of this particular sport, and this is where different countries will dominate or win in different sports. Right? But this will result in all sports being forced to be included in a tournament schedule because all countries want to win something. The implication of this is undue pressure that countries will undue pressure on these countries that they will not be able to meaningfully respond to. Additionally, because these are developing countries to begin with, what does this result in? Number one, bad planning. It is not taking into account things like geographical concerns or issues of gentrification or how this will impact local populations, which is exactly what happened in Rio. But secondly, cost cutting when it comes to security measures or like protection against migrant workers, where a lot of them die in the point of like constructing these particular stadiums because they don't have the appropriate security measures. But thirdly, abuses, things like overworking, things like exploitation, because the state doesn't directly oversee a lot of these projects. It contracts these projects out. So when you cost cut in your tendering of this particular project to different corporations, and you choose a corporation that's going to be doing this for like cheap costs so that you can spend your money elsewhere, that is when you put the lives of people at risk as a result of this. But secondly then, in the second area of in terms of readily available venues and stadiums, this is an issue as well. Do they have different venues available that can be used for a particular event? Will timing be an issue? Will venues be overly used? What about the gap between each sport? Is that going to be healthy enough so that people can take a break, or that so that athletes can, rest, or like the switch can happen more efficiently? All eyes are on you. The example is like a debate tournament that is being participated by like different countries. No one likes delays. No one likes technical problems. Imagine that, but multiply that by like 1 million people watching you. The implication of this is unfair bad press on the country that is hosting the sport. This country, especially as a possibly developing country within the region, hoping to benefit from tourism, is already doing a favor to the sporting world as a result of hosting this particular sport. You now put them in the crosshairs of bad press as a result of this undue pressure that you put onto them. Go, POI.
So surely the stadiums and like the infrastructure of the country will be taken into consideration by the overall council, mitigating a lot of your claims.
No, but like it's comparative, right? In our world, there doesn't need to be so much of considerations. In your world, there's so many considerations to take into account. So countries will just not want to bid for this, to host this particular sport in the first place, and you leave it all to your rich countries. But secondly, how does this allow for better, fairer development of sports? The frame here is simple. New sports are bound to be included, not just novel ones, but previous sports that didn't have an event in this particular major event. Through a federational democratic process, it is very slow. Addition of new sports will be inefficient because it'll be too niche and lack popularity. And additionally, according to OG's model, where it has to be unanimous, most countries will unanimously decide that this particular sport may not have the importance to be included. But here is why it's good in terms of investment. If the host country decides to include a sport that they are good at and it is a niche sport, as the country, you have two options. One, either not send the team, and we think that's perfectly fine. But two, tap into the talents of your country. Maybe the sport is like esports and you have an esports community that you can now invest in to be good at this particular sport. Even giving the example that OG talks to you about in terms of sepak takraw, that's why Malaysia invests so much into the sepak takraw team, because we can compete with Indonesia, we can compete with Thailand. The impact of this, we give local sporting communities the ability to lobby for certain sporting events. That is why squash managed to like make it into the Olympics for the next Olympics. That is why breakdancing even made a show in the recent Olympics, because local communities fought for these things, and this is more likely in the event where you have the ability to decide as a country. So proud.
Thank you very much, El, for that fine speech. DPM.
Well,
Yeah, you're audible.
okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. It is important that we're talking about international sports to always view in the landscape of what is best for everyone. I know we're in debate land and we always talk about vulnerable actors, but should we unambiguously endorse every single consideration that comes from a vulnerable actor just because they want it? We believe in a utilitarian approach that takes in consideration of the future of sports globally as a conglomerated institution. That's why we ought to win this debate. 4 callouts to opening opposition as to why they don't have any form of footing in this debate anymore. First, on the idea that appeal is exclusive. We can also have appeal in our world. I don't know why a consensus decision doesn't mean we're open to review and appealing. If there is, in fact, a sport that deserves to be in SEA Games by virtue of the sports having an upward trajectory and it's stable, by virtue of the sports being representative in many countries in Southeast Asia, not just in one country, by virtue of the sport probably being competitive enough where there's clear, quantified rules that we can make it into a game, go for it. We can still appeal in our world. What we're against is the unilateral ability for host countries to decide, I want to have this sport. You can table it, review it, appeal it in our world. If it's good enough based on the metrics of the committee, we can still pass it. Appeal is not exclusive. Second call out is the idea that opening government is defending all sports being included. No, hang on. The speaker before me asserts that our burden is to one day reach a world where every sport is being included. No. Our burden is to view it from mature factors. For example, a sport should be included if it fulfills the criteria of equity, representation, enough competitive level. In the worst case, that to some extent this would come into the trade-off of smaller sports, I would explain why this is better in the interest of international sporting events, because you are a fundamental committee, international organization. You have to set the standards, not only caring about smaller things. Third call out is the dominance of stronger countries in committee. We knew this was coming when they argued that there are majority consolidation or consideration given to bigger players within the committee. 5 mechanisms to make it more inclusive. First, we can have equal voting. I don't know what the speaker is talking about having like charter voting system, whatever. It literally doesn't exist. Everyone has 1 vote. Second, super majority voting method, where if in case every singular vote actually proves a majority to pass that spot, we would do it. Third, transparency and review. We will show the statistics on why we're okay with certain sports. Show the statistics of why the limit for these sports based on this host country is 12 or 20 according to the richness of the country. All of these things can be transparent, review, and you can appeal. Fourth, we can rotate leadership. Some countries can host it sometimes, another country can host it another time. Rotating of leadership gives you more access to be able to have more footing in the tabling. Fifth is quota. Rashwin literally explains to you why we can have policy making, like 5% of sports that we pass should be non-Olympic sports. These were mechanisms to prove why we can be inclusive. They can't just claim bigger players will always consolidate. That's why even the United Nations, where it's criticized to be Western proxy, they can still champion climate change in places like Maldives and Fiji. They can still intervene when it comes to Rwandan genocide. You can't just assert that there always be dominance. Deal with our mechanisms on why we make it more equitable. Final call out to the team. They said there's social cost. Rio de Janeiro gentrified. So many countries cost so much of baggage and hurt the vulnerable actors. These social costs are a byproduct of hosting international sporting events. What I'm doing here, Judge, is to prove to you that a lot of times the countries themselves, on their own volition and discretion, are harming the vulnerable. Look at Rio de Janeiro. They decided on themselves to gentrify the cities and blur town lines and city lines to not go into slum areas. Host countries are the one that is doing this. Qatar World Cup has so many unreported deaths of migrant workers that is done on them. What that means is that even in their world, host countries have a perverse incentive to have a sanitized image of their event at the expense of vulnerable people because they prioritize their nationalistic identity, not so much about the vulnerable worker. I don't know why the delta on opening opposition is just because you decide what spot to vote, you can also eliminate vulnerable workers, which are always a secondary consideration. I'm washing out the entire argumentation of not consideration. I'm telling you why it's social costs are a byproduct of hosting, and in both worlds, this is probably symmetrical. Three other contention on why we solidify the win. First, why should international sporting standards supersede smaller countries making executive decision? Russia is very clear with two factors. First, the committee decides an amalgamation of all factors, and this is important. Olympics is not just about one country saying we deserve the right to participate, but it's about making sure that right to participation is awarded equitably to everyone, making sure representation is awarded to everyone, not just blinded by cultural importance, but a variety of all factors. Why is it that in opening opposition's world, they will blindly decide and give credence and also funding to their own sepak takraw sport? Three reasons. First, it's a national pride. Second, you know your athletes pioneer in this field and you know that others are still coming up, so you're likely to prioritize that. Third, you literally have discretionary power to adjust bureaucracies. You can literally fund sepak takraw facilities to be better, but the tracking one is shit. The reason why is you got so many internal corruption. That's why, as mentioned, Qatar World Cup, so many unreported deaths of migrants. We can't really supersede that. At the point of ambiguity, we think it's much better that we decide on the realistic limits of the sport, the logistical feasibility, the mature considerations of equity, representation, not just culture. This, to the extent in a sphere where it's so corrupted, we can at the very least get more footing to decide an amalgamation of factors, to be more utilitarian, to maintain an international sporting event, which, by the way, makes or breaks other sports following the same standard. We think the excellent athleticism standard should be the forefront. Other considerations like equity, vulnerability should always be secondary considerations that we decide as a factor. That's why a committee is always much better because we're utilitarian. Russian gave you precedence to explain this. That's why Tokyo didn't have judo as a sport in Olympics despite them being good. That's why, as they mentioned, breakdancing was a sport, not because Paris is great at breakdancing, but because the IOC voted for it. Executive decisions are much more representative and takes in consideration the utilitarian prospect of the sport. Second argument, this clashes directly with op bench. How can we be more inclusive in the end? First mechanism is adjustment of policy. I don't know why we don't have fiat to somehow prove this centralized body or committee can have policy making like quota systems or fixed resources to equitably allocate to new sports. You table it to prove that this sport is in fact represented and growing in Southeast Asia region, not just in your sport. We will probably pass it. The better part of our world is that we have equitable allocation based on fixed resources that goes to all sports. We're giving every vulnerable actor the right to participation, not just one actor based on your cultural significance. This is why we're better. Why are we better at developing niche sport? I think this is the thing that hammers it home. Opening opposition's world says that we want to tap into talents, invest in local idea. This is a bad idea for two reasons. Number one, you would lose out if suddenly your takraw gets beaten by a Sri Lanka because you have no initial grassroots movement and not competitive enough. Number two, you're more likely to focus on professional athletes rather than developing youth if you have the discretion to decide that I can put in my professional athletes in this sport. What changes in our world? Yes, maybe in the worst case, you cannot compete in SEA Games yet, but it's more incentive because this is your niche. Malaysia, your identity of a country is back to sepak takraw. Grow it first. Develop young talent. Make sure you're super competitive that other countries can't touch you. Otherwise, at an infancy rate where you're not great yet and you enter into a market where other countries have better infrastructure and technology, they will subsume you and your identity. I'm literally flipping why the identity is worse than the world. For all those reasons, we're extremely proud to govern.
Yeah, I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the fine speech and invite the DLO.
All right, give me 1 second, yeah? Okay, sorry, I'm here. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, cool. That's great. I'll take PIs in the chat, exclusively in the chat, so don't unmute until I call your name. Probably from closing, but like opening, you can knock yourself out, I guess. I want to deal with one piece of framing before I get into the rest of my speech, which is simply this opening government contention about the prioritization of our own sports and why this is bad for the international community. 4 things here to very quickly go on. Number 1, I am unskilled as to the scale of prioritization. In so far as we as a state like Thailand is not going to only choose Thai-based sports or only choose sepak takraw. The fact that we have a list of sports and they probably include very popular sports like bowling and badminton and tennis. I am unclear the scale of this prioritization. Like, yeah, maybe you prioritize 1 or 2 additional sports that you exclusively have the benefit, but it doesn't mean this comes at the expense of very popular sports that everyone can compete with. So in order for you to argue as to why this was problematic, you have to first prove why this scale was incredibly harmful and why it mattered significantly. Because if we argue that it isn't really significant, but it's important for the small sports that they do table, I think opening opposition takes this a bit. Secondly, I want to argue why current accountability measures are insufficient. So Kuan argues that he has accountability as well, which means like accountability then exists symmetrically on both sides of the house, because I don't see any reason why we can't co-opt Kuan's similar arguments about transparency and rotating when it comes to the council. So that means the ability for you to exclude sports are greatly limited on both sides of the house, because the accountability metrics are the same. Insofar as either you decide what sports you want or a committee decides, both sides have accountability, both sides have appeal, and both sides have ability structures in order to call out certain countries, which is why Malaysia is doing this for Thailand, because we're actively calling out them from excluding popular sports like weightlifting, which is accountability does work and is probably somewhat symmetric on both sides of the house, which is I'm unclear as to why current accountability metrics as to holding these people accountable if they try to get away with sneaky stuff like this isn't effective and doesn't work. They had to prove that, not just claim that it's symmetric. But third, I'm uncertain how significant this platforming of small sports and excluding others was, given the fact that if you claim that it's very frequent and this is a revolving door of hosts, which means that most hosts will just revolve into the sports that they are comfortable with anyways, which means your sepak takraw team will definitely get a chance to sign in some SEA Games. I'm unclear as to why this was significant enough for us to always oppose it. But finally, and then this is really strange coming from Kuhan's speech, because he argues that the problem isn't the exclusion of sports, but the unilateral ability to include certain sports. And I don't know this is the only issue he has, because he concedes that the appeal process is symmetric, and therefore the debate is no longer about excluding sports, it is now about including sports on OG's benefit. The reason why this is problematic is like, what is the impact of unilaterally including sports if by your own framing no one concedes? If Thailand has a sepak takraw tournament and the only people that send are Malaysia and like Indonesia, then like let them have their sepak takraw tournament in the corner. Like this doesn't effectively impact as much people as you claim it does, because this doesn't come at the expense of other sporting events that do occur. It doesn't come at the expense of swimming, badminton, bowling, which are all sports that can happen in the SEA Games. So you have to argue why this necessarily meant that every other sport was either crowded out or just platforming these people were incredibly harmful to the point in which it should never occur. Insofar as neither of those things are substantially proven by the side of OG, they cannot take this debate. The only thing they bring to you other than that is about access and participation. First off, I prove to you why this isn't as bad as they claim, but I'll contend with that more when I get into my issue. Right. Let's talk about 2 things. First, let's talk about practical and economic benefits that Asan brought to you. So Asan tells you 2 things. Number 1, on how it affects people on the ground when it comes to gentrification and building of stadiums that individuals are not prepared. Number 2, by the way, everything else is integrated. Number 2, how it changes state behavior and now excludes and prices out certain individuals from hosting and bidding for the SEA Games. Here are 2 impacts. Number 1, it worsens the lives of civilians that didn't consent to this imposition. As to now, you get incredibly worse. When a lot of these citizens didn't consent to stadiums, to them being evicted from their houses in order to build stadiums, that means you don't have meaningful responses to exist. Which is, yes, you have a public thing of a public list of people, but we think your house forces them more likely to actually build stadiums that they don't have, because this is the comparative. On outside of the house, if we don't have a stadium for a specific sport, we're not going to have that sport in the SEA Games. On your side, if the Olympic Committee says you must have this sport in your list, that means you're forced to scramble to find infrastructure, find people to judge those sports, find people to fund those sports, and find places to allocate them. That means the more likely instance in which gentrification occurs is not because of consent. That even if it's consent on our side of the house. On your side, it's worse because you're actively forcing countries in order to gentrify, in order to bulldoze houses because you mandate that they have stadiums there. You mandate that these sports must be there, and therefore consent is far more vitiated on opening government side of the house. But number two, it also prices out states who want to hold the SEA Games. And these are important because these are states that want to hold them for many other reasons. These are states that probably can pay the SEA Games committee subsidy of fee to be in part of the committee, but cannot pay in order to build new stadiums for explicit sports that they may not have existing infrastructure to have. But these are countries that still want to host the SEA Games for several reasons. Number one, they want to host it because it's a pride and it feels good for their people and for the government as a whole. Number two, it benefits their economy in terms of tourism and gets better people to go there. But number three, it shows their involvement in the International Stage Committee. Opening government exclusively prices out these people because they cannot actively engage because now there's a forced metric that forces them to build stadiums where they couldn't have. Why is this weighing it around? Even if it comes at the expense of having some people to arbitrary decidability, number one, it allows for better diversity in the sporting achievement where not only a single country wins everything, but also number two, allows for better sporting abilities on net, where we have more efficient tournament running and more efficient allocation of resources to the tournaments and the competitions that can be hosted well. There's a better sporting event on net. But not only do we better countries' current economic standards, but access for future hosts to buy into this. This is why ASEAN's case was still important. Before I go on to the betterment of sports in terms of flexibility, Rashfin, quickly.
Host countries receive council fees from other countries and they leverage sponsorship that they get. Why then are they allowed to prioritize their own needs in sports rather than all the other countries who contribute?
Okay. First, the appeal process means that they're not significantly impacting their own needs over others. Secondly, even if they are including sports that they are good at, if one or two other countries are good at it, then just let them have the sport. You haven't proven what the harm is of letting them have the sport if nobody competes in those sports. Like, deal with the actual harm. Like, you're just spouting a bunch of economic reasons that don't actually matter in the debate. You have to deal with this actual harm, right? Secondly, let's talk about betterment of sports and flexibility. And ASEAN proves to you why this increases the growth of niche and new sports in terms of number one, sports with extremely cultural basis, like stuff like Sepak Takraw, or number two, countries who have improved niche stuff like esports. The claim is they can't happen comparatively because Kuan claims that these committees can do the same thing comparatively. Number one, on the comparative, it just doesn't look as good as on our side. Because number one, they claim that these committees are going to be fair, and they have no proof why this is the case. They can't just say fiat, because then I can say fiat that these countries are going to be good and include all sports. So actually deal with the analysis because we did. But secondly, these are probably going to be slow, and thirdly, going to be bureaucratic processes. Which means on our side of the comparative, we get to these sports quicker and platform them faster. But the response from the country is also something that ASEAN talked to you about nuance. That you can either, number one, don't send a team and you have the autonomy to don't join. If you have a bad Sepak Takraw team, don't send to Sepak Takraw. But number two, you have to tap in your new talents. That means if you want to send a Sepak Takraw team, you grow local sporting communities in these countries. You tap into local abilities and you platform them. The re in these ways is big. Big sports like swimming and boating have other competitions they can go to. Small sports don't. That means we have the exclusive ability to platform sports that matter to the people on the ground. We exclusively win this clash. So proud to host.
Thank you very much, Diallo, for concluding top half. To begin back half, MG. Clear fine speech and invite the member of the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yeah, yes, you're audible.
I would like my POIs in chat, please.
Yeah, sorry. MG, Emil, can you try to speak up a bit? Sorry.
Hello, am I audible?
Yeah, perfect now.
POIs in chat, please. Thank you. The problem with both opening teams is that they think this debate is about sports, but it is actually about politics. In extension, I will prove why this game causes disengagement in the SEA Games, proving the single largest harm where the game loses its legitimacy, winning both opening teams. And secondly, I will explain why this affects inter-ASEAN relations, winning CG on their own metric. The specific context of Southeast Asia is important. Many nations are lesser developed, such as Laos or Cambodia. Many nations are in the process of developing, such as Vietnam and Indonesia. And in general, the region faces frequent changes in power and civil instability, for example, in Myanmar. This means that nations have other proximate interests like economic development or social welfare, and organizing sporting events is of the lowest priority to most governments in Southeast Asia. Therefore, the willingness to host is tied to the discretion given to countries because it gives them more predictability over the federal budget of the game. It ensures that games will be politically popular among voters who will feel as if it is a good use of the budget. I will now explain why this disincentivizes countries from hosting the event. Opening government concedes that the council will decide on a majoritarian basis. This is terrible. If Malaysia and Singapore want judo, but Laos doesn't doesn't have enough land or resources, or is just unwilling to create a judo stadium, this means that they will have to take massive loans and slash government spending in order to finance a judo stadium. Think of how politically unpopular it is among the citizens of Laos to see millions of dollars being spent on a sport that you've never even heard of before, and think of how obsolete the infrastructure is, where you have to build a judo, karate, or air rifle stadium for the one SEA Games that you're hosting in this decade, but no one in your country plays those sports, so the stadium becomes useless afterwards because nobody in the country even knows about judo. So after you build the stadium, this means that no one else has ever any use for the stadium. The only response that we hear from the Gov bench is, well, the council would not act in this way, but that seems to undercut their own benefit, because if their argument was about how all sports should be included and how this creates some form of ASEAN unity where everyone is pleased, this necessarily means that they need to force countries like Laos and Cambodia to also include sports that are specific to some countries, for example, judo or for example, karate, even though it might be culturally irrelevant or completely foreign to a country like Cambodia. I want to now fully remove opening government from this debate. At most, athletes cannot go practice at the SEA Games this year, but they can wait another 2 years. There are also many other sporting events like the Commonwealth Games or ASEAN Games for them to attend. So this is not the tipping point for preparedness. But also, opening government is clearly the fourth, because they've struggled to find a problem with status quo. Why is it wrong that Thailand includes its national sport and allows them to celebrate their culture? This, in fact, seems to be a good thing. Opening opposition stops at saying that you might not have enough stadiums or you might not have enough resources. We broadly agree with closing government. The council would be able to take into some account the infrastructural or land considerations. So we think opening opposition here is incredibly uncharitable, where you would force people to build stadiums in land that they do not have. But at this point, we are already ahead, because our extension explains that governments might not feel like it is a relevant expenditure. Opening opposition has a capacity consideration, right? They think that countries cannot have the capacity to build all of these stadiums. Our specific issue is that countries might not feel like it's a relevant expenditure. So maybe they can build the stadium, maybe they can afford to, and they can have the land to do so, but they might not feel like it's useful to the overall economy or to the overall society. For example, if you are Laos and nobody there has ever any experience in judo, you might have the land and ability to build a judo stadium, but you might not feel like this is particularly politically relevant. Voters might find it like a weird expenditure of the government money. And so in this contribution, we are not uncharitable like opening opposition, and we bypass the responses from both Gov teams that say the council will not be unreasonable and force them to build on land that they do not have. I want to push this margin even further. This creates massive uncertainty. Even if the council has good incentives and the appeal process is somewhat good, Laos and Cambodia will be afraid that they might be accepting a bid that requires them to spend millions on a stadium they can't use after the event. This is not about whether the council is or isn't good. It is about the perception that poorer nations like Laos or Cambodia will have, where they fear that it might be possible that they are accepting a bid that is not designed with the economic considerations and social considerations of their nation. Removing discretion makes the host country feel like they have no control over the scope and scale of the SEA Games. Before they even express interest in hosting the game, they will feel as if they have very little control over the entire process, and it's happening behind these iron curtains, these closed door discussions where they might be imposed a budget that they are unable to meet. It feels like a loss of sovereignty. For poorer nations like Myanmar and Cambodia, for all of these nationalist governments, it is an incredible risk for them to accept and express desire to host an event when it's actually the council that will decide the scope and the actual budget of all of these events. This incentivizes hosting the SEA Games. This is the impact that opening opposition fails to identify. Opening half doesn't find a difference. Closing government is correct. There isn't much of a delta in this debate, because by and large, the total number of games would be the same. Football and swimming would never be removed from any of the SEA Games. Therefore, the important contribution is about how ASEAN nations perceive the SEA events. ASEAN is a region that is deeply concerned of issues surrounding non-interference and sovereignty. These are literally the founding principles in the ASEAN Charter. When Dion says it's consensus making, this doesn't apply to the specific issue of hosting SEA Games, because SEA Games are not viewed as a regional issue, is viewed as an issue of domestic policy, because it is about the infrastructure bills and the government spending and the federal budget that goes into all of the SEA Games. So it's not about consensus making, it is more about the fact that sovereignty is perceived to be infringed upon, because you have countries like Malaysia and Singapore in the council deciding how your federal budget ought to go and imposing on you a bid that you have to fulfill. The idea that countries have no discretion and powers is centralized in a council where Thailand or Vietnam can vote, for example, is deeply against the principles of sovereignty and will be rejected by other countries. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from closing.
Opening.
Yeah.
Why is the discretion need to build stadiums suddenly make it politically relevant? If you say people are dying out of poverty and they're facing violent pushbacks from military junta in Myanmar, which is more proximate.
Yeah, the point is that they would not have to spend beyond what the the voters are currently comfortable with spending and not incite all of that political backlash in a world where they have that discretion. Closing government says it pits countries against one another. But if ASEAN cares about consensus, if Thailand appeals, Malaysia would approve. And now it appears that Malaysia had the power and the choice to decide, which is something that builds diplomacy and is something that builds inter-ASEAN unity, instead of it being imposed by a council. So the only world where the CG harm of pitting countries against one another activates is in a world where Malaysia rejects Thailand's bid. But the way that it is framed is an opportunity for Malaysia to extend an olive branch to Thailand by accepting Thailand's appeal. So instead of it being pitting countries against one another, it's actually a political platform that allows Malaysia to acknowledge the cultural uniqueness of Thailand. This is what causes all of in the counterfactual, this is where the SEA Games losers buy in. Countries refuse to host and they send their athletes to other games instead, because the SEA Games is viewed as an institution that undermines their sovereignty by forcing bids on them and forcing them to host a game where they have no control over the scope and scale. But the missing frame in opening opposition is about what sporting events are meant for. It is not about celebrating athleticism or sportsmanship. Sporting events are political tools. It is about the appearance of unity and cooperation. The rotation across all different ASEAN nations is a symbol of ASEAN unity and a platform for diplomacy and cooperation. If countries disengage and is rotated just between Malaysia and Singapore, it is not regional and inclusive anymore. Therefore, the question of this debate is how do we get buy-in from countries like Laos and Cambodia and Myanmar? The question, therefore, is will they want to accept a bid where the council is the one that imposes on them federal budgets and imposes on them infrastructural bills?
Thank you very much, Emo, for that fine speech. GovWeb.
Hello, sorry. Give me a second. Can I be heard?
Yes, you're audible.
All right, that's great. Yeah. Background might be slightly noisy at a few points in time, but hopefully I'll still be loud enough. All right, give me a second. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Kevin gets Dion's extension largely wrong. Because the way in which he tries to describe the two outcomes is to say that it's either a way in which you can extend an olive branch or show the ability to have some forms of unity. What Dion tells you is this is not a tool of peace, this is a tool of conflict, because this is a zero-sum game in which one party must lose. There are two possible outcomes that can happen here. One is that Malaysia accepts this. This harms domestic perceptions because Malaysians now say, what the hell? Why are you conceding towards another country imposing their desires or imposing their interests on you? Why are they taking out a game that I personally would have wanted to, or including a game that our country is not good at? That's fundamentally harmful. The second, which is even more harmful, is that Malaysia rejects this bid. This therefore means that this hurts Thai perceptions. For example, the Thai government now also has the same degree of perceptions that are now harmed towards their own government, and also harms relations between countries because you're explicitly telling another country that their perceptions of what games should be included and their perceptions of what games are valid within the SEA Games is wrong. That is fundamentally what hurts relations, and that is the genesis of Dion's extension. What Dion tells you is that regardless of outcome, you are pitting cultures and interests against one another on the global stage. This is why behind closed door negotiations are significantly better, because you're not going against one another in a public forum in which one must win or lose and there's dominance that's being asserted. Rather, you're actually able to come to a consensus with regards to interest, which has been the ASEAN way for the longest period of time. What then does Kevin tell you with regards to the loss of legitimacy? He tells you that countries, or there are two possibilities. One is that countries are now forced to do the bid, but Kevin himself admits that this is not the potential counterfactual, because we have already proven that there's going to be a possession, the council is going to decide whether you are appropriately you're able to host this in the first place. And so therefore, this isn't part of the debate. Rather, the second thing which he states is that this therefore means that countries are not going to be harmed. This therefore means that countries are not going to want to host regardless. The reason why this isn't true is because Dion tells you how countries have a say over the consensus period. Specifically, Dion measures how when they have a voice, they are better able to come to the table, because behind closed negotiations, they're actually able to talk through their problems and have the say in which what things should be part of the bill in the first place. And this is particularly why ASEAN being built on consensus is an important part of this debate, because the very fact that ASEAN has always come together and has always been part of the idea that we should have a forum in which we air our views and come to a compromise means necessarily that when these countries come with these ideas of I can't host this or I can't do this, that is going to be factored into the budget decision to begin with. There's no big country or big player that's going to shut down these small countries and say, no, you can't do that. That isn't the ASEAN way. Secondly, this is taking them at their best. This leads to the subsequent harm in which they don't host. I have two responses why to this. The first is that there are often sufficient countries countries to host regardless. That is to say that many countries are able to host this in terms of like the generic games that are being hosted. There are a lot of countries that exist within these stadiums and therefore are able to host regardless. Secondly, the biggest consequence that they're able to follow is that a small number of states don't succeed, or a small number of states are scared of bidding. But the only examples they give you are countries like Myanmar, for example, which are fearful of ASEAN. Likely these countries are not going to host regardless. Likely they feel relatively distant from ASEAN anyways. It's probably the countries that feel relatively close to ASEAN, or the majority of the ASEAN bloc, they will still host regardless because they still have a trust in the consensus process that ASEAN has prided themselves on for the longest period of time. What else does Dion tell you? Dion tells you this is particularly harmful for reputation. That is to say that when you fail, it's particularly harmful because you're now going to be hounded by domestic perception. Why then does this win over OO? So like OG. Because OG mainly tells you the idea that this is important for athletes. However, we prove that there's a tangible effect on international image and reputation. When cultures are pitted against one another, this is a starting point for a large amount of tension. Even if it isn't tension, there's a starting point for pride, national pride that's now being hurt, which has a far larger scale of impact across the domestic scene rather than a couple of athletes. This also implicates the public. Necessarily, this means that regardless that in terms of like which like form of decision making is better, we think that the decision making that behind closed doors is significantly better because it means that we're better able to come to this consensus without airing our dirty laundry. Secondly, what does it also tell? What does OG tell you? OG tells you that the international success exists, but ultimately we think that we can sidestep the idea of international success. It is likely that the most popular games are going to be played anyways, as O rightly points out. In fact, if countries really want to do well internationally, they're likely going to participate within these games and openly flag these games within their list anyways, because they do want to do well on the international stage. Because of these reasons, we likely think that we're able to supersede OG because they're able to prove a larger scale of harm as well. Before I go on, Sio.
Even if
Sio?
Cambodia could appeal to the council, this feels like a loss of sovereignty because the federal budget has to be approved by a council that isn't the Cambodian government first, which makes it feel as if they don't have control.
Okay, so there are two potential processes here. The first is that the country voices these out at the start. What can I do? What stadiums do I have? What logistics do I have? How much resources and how much budget do I put in? The council then says and comes to a consensus on what the list is and what therefore the budget as a result is. The country can then decide, should I pull out or should I not? Possibly, it's also the case that because the council is one that's made of ASEAN states, if they need a small top-up in terms of the amount of funds to, like, for example, build stadiums or to fund referees, for example, that is likely something that is potentially going to be afforded by these other countries as well. Therefore, it is likely not the case that you're going to be oversubscribing their budget, and if countries really aren't able to do so, then they aren't going to host. And we've already pushed for why there's still a counterfactual we're willing to accept, and we think that largely is the case that countries behind closed doors are better able to come to a discussion with regards to what budgets are within their means, rather than having appeals shoved in their face, which oftentimes forces them to accept different sports which they don't have the capability of doing, which then leads to all of the zero-sum impacts and zero-sum competition harms that Dion tells you about. Now, why do we beat OO? OO tells you three main arguments. The first is that there's an ability to host. Likely this shifts in the counterfactual. That is to say, when there's a more standardized list of sports, you can enable more preparation on things like venues and logistics. For example, if you know that the sport list has been like concretized or it's like relatively like set in stone and people will not just randomly throw sports into there, you don't need to prep for these stadiums in advance. Likely these countries are able to shift production or shift preparation of these stadiums towards these more popular sports. You can also still evaluate on your own capacity what is best. Secondly, if LDCs really can't, then they don't. This is where things like checks and balances, things like feasibility checks come in handy, and the council will decide against this. These are responses that have already been stated. And we also think that it's entirely possible that ASEAN 8 can come in to help out. Thirdly, notice that this is necessarily undercut when DLO comes up and tells you it's one or two prioritizations. If it's really one or two prioritizations or one or two sports that are changed, likely the economic impact on the country is likely going to be fairly minimal, and we don't think this actually constitutes a massive delta in this round. The second thing they tell you is overshadowing. The counterfactual here is that the SEA Games and sports list is delegitimized. This is something I'm going to push uniquely in the sense that this ultimately means that the competition itself and the prestige of the competition is harmed because people look towards this competition and say the country itself impose these like regulations or impose these sports that they want to personally participate in. It means that even if they win a larger medal tally, people are necessarily going to delegitimize this achievements because it wasn't made on a consensus basis. It means that there's poor optics with regards to the competition. There's less legitimacy amongst fans and athletes. Oftentimes this leads to less participation or potentially less sponsorship and less buy-in overall. This means that you can't just not send a team because it's particularly humiliating for a country to choose not to send a team and harm their medal tally as a result. So this overshadowing idea is ultimately less important than the general ability for you to legitimize the sport and have people buy into it as a whole, which only happens under Dion's model of consensus. Lastly, on local sporting communities, we think that likely are still going to be developed insofar as sports are culturally important. Things like national tournaments will still exist. Insofar as ingrained into the national identity, people will still play it and people will still tout it in the systems. Because Dion is the only, and CEO is the CG is the only side that tells you the difference between appeal system and consensus system and which system is the best able to achieve optical benefits and unity within the CG takes as well.
Thank you very much, Governor Whip, for your fine speech. To conclude around the opposition whip.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you're audible.
Debate is a weighing of probabilities and skill. So even if Malaysia rejects and appeals the process, it does not weigh against for a few reasons. One, they never explain the incentives for this particular country to reject. In fact, all countries or all teams in this world has been unable to explain what the delta in this debate is, and also why it is likely that there will be a rejection of certain sports just because it is something that's dominant in one country. But secondly, they never weigh against the kind of like interest or the kind of like things that happen with regards to domestic politics and how precisely it is because there's certain kinds of appeal systems that happen that the country feels more agentic with regards to how they feel about hosting a certain country to begin with. In the absence of this process, and in the instance where you have a council, what happens as a result is that you remove the agency of this particular country to feel like they have some control over domestic politics as a result of heavily spending on facilities, heavily spending on things, for example. I'm going to talk about two things in my speech. First, on ASEAN and politics, which is the clear extension that I think O doesn't want to buy, but also talk about the opening half to explain why exactly they were stuck in a bad motion, but unfortunately they have no extension. So firstly, on ASEAN and politics, the claim from CG here is that the process of negotiation on opposition is public and therefore adversarial in nature. But we think this is inaccurate for a few reasons. One, Kevin explains and specifically explains how the region of politics is rife with uncertainty, and hence there's low procedural need for us to therefore host this particular politics or host these particular games to begin with. And we think that this particular incentive structure is important because, as Kevin explained, there are multiple competing games that exist, for example, Commonwealth Games and, for example, Asian Games, where all the Asian Olympics people can also participate in. So, in the interest or in the situation where there's no party that's willing to host or less party that's willing to host the Southeast Asian Games, we think we are likely to create even worse outcomes in terms of perception, but also in terms of the ability for them to therefore decide or to grow the kind of talent pool to begin with. But in the instance where they don't get in the first point of authority to decide because of the introduction of a council, what happens as a consequence is that they feel incentive, significantly less incentive for them to host because of the sunk cost that kind of exists because of the kind of sports they have to therefore create or the facilities that they have to create in order to host specific skill sets or specific kind of like facilities for the sports to begin with. What we do is that we allow discretion, which means that therefore countries by themselves, at the first point of entry of considering to host a country, can control the kind of discourse that happens as a consequence. CG says that this particular process is adversarial, but we think that the adversarial process is only at the point of the discussion rather than rife across the hosting of the particular event and after the event to begin with, when citizens of the country think about how exactly they spend the money and also like end up like wasting the particular resource because of all the things that happens with regards to dead facilities that don't get used to begin with. Why is control the tipping point in this debate? One, this undercuts the adversarial elements of CG because the perception that these countries have on these events is that they are hamstrung and blindsided by the council and therefore has less ability to decide of this particular process as well. But two, in an instance where there's imposing more international discretion on domestic politics, we have received insufficient response from CG as well as OG. If you want PY, ask, sure. But also in terms of like the ability for us to think about why exactly no country out there wants to have their domestic politics intervened with by a council to begin with, to decide how much money to spend on a game and how much facilities they have to build in order for them to therefore host this particular Olympics. The upshot of this particular argument is that less countries will therefore host this game to begin with. CG and their what the analysis coming from GovWeb was the suggestion that Laos and Myanmar will never host the games anyway, and therefore they won't do this. But if you just look wider into the game in the arena of Southeast Asia, actually many of the countries fit within the purview of what Kevin talks about, which is many countries rife with internal politics and all these things that currently exist and also have no resources. And therefore, it is important for these particular countries to be able to therefore decide and able to therefore think about whether or not they want to participate in the first place or whether or not they want to host in the first place, which we think is important. The reason why this is tipping for the ASEAN movement or the ASEAN as a whole is that the ASEAN currently is very delicate in terms of its structure, in terms of its ability to therefore talk about non-intervention within its politics to begin with. The moment you allow a council to therefore intervene, what happens as a result is no other country will want to host. And it is also very true that many of the countries will therefore not happen to have a hosting ability to begin with. As a consequence of this, less countries able to host, bigger countries host, therefore it is likely that this will become a less relevant agency or less relevant sporting event. Why is the appeals process therefore better? The first thing to highlight here is that the appeals process is iterative. What this means is that there's an appeals process, which means Malaysia can therefore appeal in this particular process. But also importantly, what happens in this particular debate is that the appeals process allows for the first mover to talk about what the potential concerns with regards to this, which is at the very least more public and better than compared to what the opposition, what the government tries to talk about with regards to behind the curtains and behind the veil of ignorance, and not the veil of ignorance, sorry, behind the background to begin with. What is the outcome of this? Number one, in the instance where you expose people to this kind of like situation, what happens as a consequence is that there's a lack of buy-in, as Kevin once explained, and also the kind of problems with regards to how exactly countries buy in to begin with. But before that, OG.
If sports is already unpopular and less proximate, why the specific decision to control discourse a tipping point if other agencies are given to this country, right to participate, right to vote, right to select your athletes? Why is this right somehow making sports popular?
Like, okay, if let's say I choose to want to host a debate competition, I would want to decide how many people or how many tournaments are there because of capacity issues, because of all these things that currently exist. But in the instance, if you remove that and you allow someone else to tell that for me, we think that removes the ability for us to have some control over this event. And therefore, as a consequence, I wouldn't want to host it as a consequence. I'm sorry for this intuition pump, but it is as easy as I can put it. I just don't know why exactly it is not like leaning for you guys. So therefore, comparatively, the best extension is behind closed doors is good. But we think that what this does is that it needs weighing through, because it is unclear why discussions will happen under CG's side. But also, we think that the appeals process allows for discretion at the first post. It is important because it is important to spark interest as the agent to host and intending to have the subjects themselves to change this particular thing. In the instance where OO as well as OG doesn't prove any saliency with regards to the delta of what changes in this debate, and OO doesn't conflicts with themselves in terms of explaining how exactly this particular sporting event will therefore have many people bulldoze homes out of the situation because they don't explain the difference in terms of the facilities, they lose this debate. Opening loses this debate. We are very proud to take on CGCO.
Thanks, Opweb, for your fine speech. Thanks, everyone, for what was a high-quality debate. Please give us 15 to 20 minutes to go to Discord and deliberate.